All right, should be live. We'll see if it kicks in on Twitch. Yep. All right. So, as you can see, I am going to be reading directly from the actual book. Now, the trick here is I had originally planned to use an actual broadcasting mic and setup, but because we're kind of in flux right now with moving from where we work during the school year to where we're going to be living with my in-laws, I haven't had time to set everything up in a really nice formal setting. So hopefully the audio is going to be good. I tested it with wearing a headset, which I thought looked kind of stupid, and with just the MacBook mic capture, which seemed to work pretty well. But if you have any issues with the audio between sections that I read, I will try to check chat for an idea of how this is going to work. I had asked people what they wanted. Did they want me to read with text on the screen so you could kind of follow along? Did they want me to read from the book and they'd be able to see me reading? Did they want there to be just something in the background and they didn't see me or text, but just sort of were listening to it audio format? The people who voted to actually be watching me reading. So we're going to try that for this one, and we will see how it goes and if people like it. For future broadcasts, I may try something else if there's a strong push to do something different. The reason I'm doing this is mostly because a lot of readers or potential readers said that they would love to read the book, but they don't have time and they'd prefer something audio. And audiobooks are actually really difficult to produce. They can be very expensive or have poor quality. By using Twitch, I'm hoping that the errors I might make reading, the places where I might pause or clear my throat or something like that, which I would have to then edit out or redo sections of an audiobook, those won't be so much of an issue because it's me just live reading. So, like I said, this is really a test run for me. I don't know how it's going to work out. And because I'm starting from the beginning of the first book, The Sword, which you can get on Amazon under T.H. Paul, it's lengthy, so we'll see how long it takes me to read through. There's a few breaks in the prologue, and I may stop after an hour if it feels like that's an appropriate place to just stop. For those who were interested in the audiobooks that I mentioned before, I'm going to put these up on YouTube in a format that people can actually get and download into an MP3 or MP4 type file that they could then just listen to if they only want to listen to it. And I'll take out all this intro stuff and other audio bits, and it will just be the book. Because I'm going to be reading, I won't be able to answer questions in the chat, but please put them in. I will look between sections, and at the end of the reading, I will say, okay, I'm just going to do Q&A if anybody has any questions. If you don't have questions, I'll wait a couple minutes. Nothing comes up, that'll be it. Shut the stream off and be done. If questions do come up, I'll try to answer them. I may say that there's something that I can't answer because of plot points or things that come up later. So, all right. One final warning. If you like epic fantasy, this is probably going to be great. I hope you think it's great, at least. If you don't like a lot of world building, the prologue spends a lot of time setting things up, and you're supposed to be a bit confused. That's okay. If this is a bit overwhelming, maybe tuning in on Wednesday when I do the first chapter of the book when it's much more character oriented will be more up your alley. Okay, so this is The Legacy Chronicle, The Sword by myself, T.H. Paul, starting from the prologue. I'm going to try to put the book in a nice aesthetically pleasing position so you can see me reading. It is an inn with a well-worn floor of solid oak and hearty welcoming fire blazing steadily in one corner. On a cold winter night such as this, a fire is an essential luxury. The patrons are spread about the building at various tables and benches, sipping on mugs of ale and picking up bowls of stew and roast chicken with an air of relaxation and calm. Outside, the wind bellows and blusters against the walls of the establishment, but does not pierce the cracks that have been well sealed by her many generations of caretakers. Unlike city taverns, this is not a boisterous or raucous crowd of customers, but a calmly familiar one. Accustomed to coming regularly for a drink and a bite to eat, they sit with a patience their long days of work require. Nothing at the Inn of the Four Winds happens suddenly, or at least nothing had for some time. The bartender and innkeeper, a young man whose years suggested he should instead have been a stable hand or cook's assistant, rubbed down the long bar with a clean cloth. He wore away at the same spot with a casual boredom, as though some stain only he could see was refusing to come off the wood. His father, and his father's father, and most likely his father before him, had maintained the inn since its construction. The young man had, sadly, recently inherited his family's legacy by unhappy circumstance. His experience came from watching his recently passed father, and on nights like this, he had seen him massage this same spot methodically. Having learned from observation, he followed the example precisely. There was no need to be ever vigilant. Waitresses moved languidly about the floor, casually exchanging conversations with the customers and delivering food and drink at a steady but unhurried pace. The crowd, though the term would seem too unruly for such a passive group of people, was comfortable allowing this lethargic pace of life to continue about them. A few children moved about on the floor at a slightly faster pace, playing at adventures with one another against invisible foes. To a one, their parents were grateful for a lack of true danger in their lives. On many nights there might be a minstrel or traveling bard at the inn weaving tales, but this evening the raised stages sat empty, though an outside observer would probably have thought this was preferable to the introspective men and women seated about the inn. The door to the common area flew open and a large, but not especially tall, hooded figure swept in with a burst of cold air and snow that stirred the sedentary patrons within. His cloak, for it was a he, swirled in the wind and swung behind him as he thrust the door closed and stamped his heavy boots free of the white slush upon them. Shaking himself like a dog, he reached up and pulled his hood back, revealing a long mane of straight though disheveled gray hair. As he turned to the crowd of curious onlookers, they relaxed at seeing a visitor they knew. A traveler he was, yes, but a frequent patron of the inn as well. Moreover, the man was an appreciated guest. There was an air of quiet respect from the patrons as he turned and took in the scene, a subtle hint of sadness on his face as he scanned those about him. The innkeeper may have been young, but he knew the latest arrival on sight. He strode earnestly forward and bowed slightly, even as the older man dismissed the honor with a wave of one gloved hand. They spoke in quiet tones, and the younger man led his new guest to the bar and a high seat at its curving corner, which hooked back at a right angle to the least popular seats furthest from the fire. The older gentleman, for surely with his fine cloak he was his gentleman, even if his armor, scabbard, and other apparel were well worn and weather-beaten, settled with familiarity into his seat, taking a long look at the empty one to his left. Having skittered around the bar, the innkeeper placed a mug and some bread rolls before him. The old man glanced at the brew in his mug and grunted, motioning the barkeep closer. "I would prefer the autumn ale." The younger man looked at him confused, saying, "But it's midwinter, my lord." "Do not call me that." The older man spoke sharply, then with a more civil tone added, "Your father always kept a spare barrel in the kitchen, opposite and sheltered from the ovens. I am sure it's still there." Before he could elaborate further, the owner had swiped the mug from the bar and sprinted for the back, downing half the contents as he went. Whether this was to save the already poured drink or because he was aiming to calm his nerves was not clear, but his newest guest chuckled softly to himself as he unhooked his sword and cloak and settled them against the bar and back of his chair respectively. As he did, one of the children, a young girl in a faint blue dress of heavy wool, approached him and stood quietly by his stool. At first the older man glanced at her with a friendly smile, then turned back to his bowl, taking a small roll and tearing a hearty bite from it. But as he chewed slowly, he noticed she had not moved, and, struggling to swallow his overly large first taste, asked cordially, "Can I help you, young lady?" A few other boys and girls stood a short distance back, watching the exchange with anxious excitement, and the man realized he had unwittingly acquired an audience. The young girl, her large eyes taking in his worn gear, said, "Can you tell us a story?" The man could not suppress a laugh at the impetuous question, both inquiring and demanding at the same time. He noted some adults by the fire, probably parents who had not expected to fill that role for at least a few precious minutes, realizing to their horror what was afoot, and trying to determine how best to interfere. At the same moment, the now pleased innkeeper had returned with a frothing mug, stopped dead in his tracks, color draining from his face, at the sight of the daringly insistent girl whose hands had emphatically found their way to her hips. The entire scene caused the newcomer to laugh all the harder as he bent lower to meet his interrogator's eyes. "Well, I think my old mind still holds a tale or two. Would you let me have a drink, and then I could share one? Perhaps the legend of Bull the Warrior, or the tales of the Sun People to the south, or even the mysterious histories of the distant elven kingdoms." The girl did an odd thing then. She glanced back at her companions, who made desperate motions with their hands, urging her on. The brash approach that had marked her first inquiry suddenly evaporated, and she struggled to meet the eyes of the man she had just addressed so directly a moment before. "We were wondering," she said quietly, as she looked at her wood shoes rubbing uncomfortably against one another, "if you would tell us your story. We heard—" She looked at once again at her friends, who now stood stock still in anticipation. "We heard you were a great hero, a king even." The excitement in her voice at the last proclamation was audible, but the silence of the unmoving and now very aware crowd of customers was far louder. The gray-haired man sat there, and to all about him he seemed to have aged still further, his shoulders and head bent under a great weight none of them understood. He sat there for what seemed an eternity, before letting out a great sigh and saying softly, "My story." He paused for some time as though pondering. "That's a very long and very sad tale, my child. However, if you and your friends truly wish to hear it, I will tell you." The distant followers rushed forward earnestly, shouting and crying, "Yes, yes, please, tell us." As they did, frightened and embarrassed parents rushed forward, joined by the now terrified innkeeper, to protest emphatically that they were eternally sorry for the behavior of their offspring, and swearing to do anything from grooming the man's horse to showering him with the few coins they had, if only he would forgive them. He raised his hands to quiet them and eventually succeeded. As the roar died down to a dull hum, he said, just loudly enough for all to hear, "This lovely young lady has asked for my story, and I have agreed to give it to her." He paused and looked at the girl, now blushing at the attention she had attracted, and winked broadly. "But first I will wet my throat from the dust, snow of the road, and then you may have your tale. And be warned," his face now took on a terribly serious look, "I will not abbreviate, nor rush the telling. This may require many nights of dull prattling on my part. I will likely need a room." Before he could finish the sentence, the innkeeper was assuring him his usual space could be provided at a hefty discount, free even, for as long as the traveler wished. Waving away invitations to seat himself on the stage, and settling more comfortably into his stool, the man waited briefly for the attention of all. True to his word, he took a long pull from his mug, as the already captive audience of adults and children, even the formerly panicked owner of the establishment, pulled stools, chairs, and barrels about him. Setting his mug down and taking the initial requesting child upon his knee, he breathed deeply and began. "It was long ago, and I was then a very young man, on a simple journey, and having no understanding of the hardest realities of the world or the great miseries and joys I was to experience." As he continued, the eager listeners pulled their seats closer. And this is the story he told. Taking a quick break. All right. In the middle of a deep, indescript valley, there sits a large meeting hall. Surrounded on all sides by open fields, small streams, and high mountains, it is an unusual sight as it rises from the grass around its white marble steps. A smooth slate roof covers the top, supported on all sides by high archways of the same polished, simple stone as the base. From the outside, the hall looks like nothing more than a nondescript temple to some long-forgotten deity, its only curiosity being that it is the sole structure occupying the lands about it. Alone in the valley, the shadows of the roof creating a darkness so deep one cannot see beyond the arches within, the meeting hall waits, seemingly for no one. Within the hall is a very different matter. If anyone were to step behind the pillars, braving the darkness, they would learn the truth behind the temple. Inside, 3 large hanging braziers of ever-burning flame dangle from the eaves. The archways, simple and uniform on the outside, bear strange and intricate designs to be seen by anyone setting foot within. On one, branches and leaves twist and intertwine to form the arch. Another is made of broken blades and battered shields. Still another is formed from the very bones of men. Just as one cannot see into the hall from its exterior, they cannot look outward. Darkness shrouds the world beyond the arches, and any attempt to leave through them would yield only frustration and failure. The room itself holds only one item of interest, a massive table that extends the full length of the hall and houses spaces for 14 chairs that are not there. At one end, the table is a white glistening marble specked with golden stone, extending to a solid but pleasantly glossed oaken center strip, and finally ending in a blackened stretch that looks charred to the point of collapse. Despite the appearance of singed wood and rot, the blasted end is smooth to the touch and colder than a deep frost. That side of the table gives off darkness like a heavy blanket, just as the white marble end emits a pleasant light and warmth. Between them both, the simple wooden center holds a careful balance of the two, as though it consciously strives to temper the auras about it. This is where, long ago, the 14 first gods of Teth Tanir were swept into a great torrent of events that would forever change the godly realms and the mortal world they had once made and cultivated together. To those 14 immortals and their lesser kindred, this sacred structure is known simply as the Archway Temple. On this particular day, the oddly isolated building had an even odder occupant. An old man lay sprawled on the floor, snoring uproariously. He was bizarre-looking, with pale bluish skin and long snow-white hair, with tiny horns protruding up and back from his forehead. His face was fair and smooth, but his fine red coat was rumpled, stained, and dusty, despite there being no evidence of grime in the room. Suddenly he shook his head and cocked it to one side as though straining to hear a distant sound. He blinked his eyes several times, at first from sleepiness and then in surprise. Standing, he ineffectively tried to smooth over his coat and baggy black breeches before he stamped his feet and emitted a massive yawn. Stretching his arms, he lethargically walked toward the table, muttering to himself in a strange voice interrupted by rhythmic grunts and groans. So, it must come to this again. There will be a meeting, another fruitless argument. Will there be an end to this bickering? Home. As much as an end can be made. Reaching the table's center, he held his hand over it and began mumbling to himself again. What was the word? Old word. Old. He suddenly brightened and smiled. Ah, right. Calavorsa. Alopa Calavorsa. The table shimmered, and from inexplicable depths within it came a small gong and mallet of shining silvery metal. The old man nodded satisfactorily and picked up the mallet, sizing up the gong hovering above the center of the table with an unhappy eye. Endless, all of it, pointless besides, home. Whatever made my ancestors take up this position. Grimacing, he raised the mallet and sighed. Let us begin, then. The shimmering gong made a clear note that hung in the air with a shine of its own, as though the polish on the metal lent itself to the sound. It subsided shortly, and the man walked toward the wall behind him, the mallet still in his hand as the gong remained hovering over the table. Turning to face the expansive hall, he sat on a small cushioned wooden stool that suddenly appeared beneath him. Placing the mallet on his knees, he waited, albeit briefly. The first to arrive was Tyrannus, the war god. All who were coming to the meeting would be the first gods, the greatest of all the immortals, here to discuss matters of consequence to the sphere of Teth Tanir, which they had, as one, created. Though they had all once made that mortal world together, as a cooperative product of balancing powers, the first gods are the purest forms of their ideals, and ideals often conflict. As mortal beings begin to emerge and spread across the home that was gifted to them, their interactions in evolution gave birth to more lesser gods. In time, the mortals' passions also changed the more powerful 14 first gods in drastic ways. The gods had created mortals, but their relationship was complexly intertwined, and in short order, it had become mutually dependent. The gods needed the mortals in their faith as much as the mortals needed the gods in their blessings, perhaps even more so. That interdependence had spawned great contention over the responsibility of godly immortals to the residents of their greatest work, this world of Teth Tanir. All this and more was well known to Tyrannus as the god stepped determinedly from his arch. His form was that of a bodiless suit of burnished armor that protruded spikes and sharp edges from all angles. His chair appeared before the table's center, opposite and to the left of the strange old man with the mallet. It was a titanic thing of metal and iron that fairly breathed danger. Tyrannus stood behind his seat, armored gauntlets on its back. He surveyed the table silently with glowing golden eyes from behind his fearsome helm. The old man spoke. There's going to be more killing, perhaps. Home. Tyrannus said nothing. Home. I thought you would be pleased that some new, warriors would be sent to you soon. Tyrannus's eyes drifted to the blood-red leather on his seat back, and his voice rumbled like an avalanche. There's no honor in these petty feuds. The old man regarded him quizzically. I thought it was Paladinus who dealt in honor. Tyrannus's eyes flared as he turned toward the elderly figure briefly, and then he swept around to seat himself, ignoring the other occupant pointedly. As he fell into his seat, two more shapes appeared from the arches near the blackened end of the table. The two eyed each other as if considering how closely their allegiance held them, and then together stared at Tyrannus with obvious contempt. Tyrannus glared right back through the new arrivals, and they shifted slightly under his challenging gaze. These two were not used to being treated with such open fearlessness. They were Balthazane and Xanaroth, the gods of betrayal and hatred, respectively. A white-hot anger constantly raged behind Xanaroth's dark eyes as he surveyed the table, failing to conceal his fierce personality behind his stiff stance. He wore only a slim black robe with silver trim and carried a black staff that he gripped with white knuckles, divulging his true emotions. Xanaroth strode to the table from his arch and sat in his chair of thorns, holding Tyrannus's gaze as though daring him to speak. Balthazane was far subtler than his volatile brother. A handsome and cutting figure, he was dressed finely in a silk coat of forest green, and matching pants with gold trim and well-oiled leather boots. His hair was a light brown with gray fringe, and he had a disconcerting smile that almost distracted you from the cruel blue eyes. He was utter confidence now as he studied Tyrannus from his archway, his hands folded carefully in front of his chest, while he smiled sardonically. Tyrannus, my good warmonger, he said smoothly. I had expected a friendlier greeting than this. Tyrannus's eyes blazed. I do not associate with spies and cowards, and since you represent both, I shall not waste my words on you. Balthazane's smile never wavered, but his eyes did grow tighter. If you had truly studied the art you supposedly command, you would know that spies are as much a part of war as those who shed blood on the field. Taranis made no move to reply, and Xanaroth jumped at his opening. "You're a coward, Taranis. Once you fought beside our father against the danger beyond our realms, now you hide in your pocket of the immortal world and wither away. Only the violence of mortal hearts keeps you fueled with their faith. Violence," Xanaroth grinned devilishly, "and hatred." The war god refused to rise to the bait from Xanaroth, who fumed at his failure as Balthazar laughed. "You see, brother, even the hot-blooded Taranis may hold his anger when it suits him. That should come in handy today. I doubt this meeting has been called to form some kind of lasting peace." Balthazane's smile disappeared briefly, and a doubtful gaze overcame his eyes, before he restored his outward aloofness and sat in his finely carved and leathered chair. What could she possibly have to say that warrants this meeting? Is she going to again pretend to take the punishment she so rightly deserves? Even I find her past betrayals impossible to forgive. Taranis leapt up suddenly, his massive frame of metal edges seeming to fill the hall. His eyes flared red and his hand strayed to his side. "You will not speak of her in that tone. Whatever her actions, she is one of the first of us, and you would not be here if not for her." Balthazar waved his bejeweled fingers disarmingly, and a delicate file appeared, which began rubbing calmly against his nails. "So I see not all threats can be ignored, Taranis. But you know better than any the rules of our realm. You cannot harm me here, nor I you. We are on safe ground. However," Balthazar stopped his preening and pointed the file at the irate god, "if you are interested, then I might be happy to welcome you into my home. I have several toys you might find invigorating." Taranis managed to contain himself, his blazing eyes dimmed, and he slowly lowered himself into his seat, ignoring the snickering of Xanaroth and the triumphant smile of Balthazar. The war god chastised himself for his foolishness, as he had revealed a hot temper at the most inopportune moment. A calm and relaxed approach would be necessary at this meeting. As he cooled his simmering rage, another of the sitters arrived. Lorima, goddess of nature, appeared from her arch, unaware of what had just transpired, and sat gracefully on her living oaken chair next to Taranis without a word to anyone. Taranis eyed her and inclined his head in greeting, surprised to note that she nodded back. Such an exchange was rare between the two who disagreed so often, but now they were clearly allied in trepidation of what was to come. Lorima had bark skin of the same roughness and color as a live pine, and hair of moss that hung to her waist. She wore no clothing, and her body had a shape vaguely humanoid and feminine, but at the same time indistinct in race or age. Her eyes were large golden orbs, imposing and with a powerful inner light that brooked no argument. She laid a calming hand on Taranis' own, as though she could sense his mood, and he relaxed visibly. Her eyes shot a sharp look at Balthazar, who grinned back innocently and held up his hands in mock surrender. At that moment, a man and a woman, both clad in white robes with gold belts and jet black hair, appeared at the pearly white end of the table, holding hands and speaking softly to one another. Delvidia, goddess of joy, and her twin brother Rheus, god of hope, glided into the room apparently unaware of the presence of the others. Rheus looked to be consoling his sister, something he frequently did for everyone who came to him with a problem. Xanaroth's eyes grew still fiercer at his arrival, and the raging god spat out sharply, "I see you still haven't decided whether to counsel your sister or sleep with her, Rheus. Perhaps it's because you would not know what to do in bed with a woman." Rheus calmly held back a furious Delvidia as he met Xanaroth's fierce glare and smiled gently, as though he were dealing with a child in the midst of an especially irrational temper tantrum. Carefully seating his sister at her glowing, soft-cushioned wooden chair, he walked around to his own seat of beautifully carved stone depicting many birds in flight. Running his hands over the etchings, he studied its intricacies before replying in a soft, lecturing tone, "Xanaroth, you continually seem to think that pleasure can only come from the flesh, when you completely miss the greater joy that may be found in the soul. Spare me your filthy preaching, coward. Joy is nothing compared to the elation that comes from pain and rage." Rheus smiled and sat slowly, shaking his head. "To think that once you were the greatest advocate of peace among us. How much change has come with time." Xanaroth's fury seemed to explode, and he leapt up, hurling his chair to the floor, and thrusting towards Rheus a sword that suddenly appeared in his hand. "Damn your blinded eyes! That was never to be spoken of again. I will carve you into shreds and leave the rest to weep in the fires of our realm for all eternity." "No, Xanaroth, I think that shall wait." All the seated gods turned in tense silence, from Xanaroth's violent outburst to the woman who now stood behind a high golden throne depicting a sun shedding rays of bright light over the world. She was wearing a golden tiara that matched the silver one on Delvidia's head, though where Delvidia stood out in her raven black hair, this woman's brilliant tresses were far outshone by her crown. She was Alanormir, the goddess of life and guardian of mortals, and an imposing presence to say the least. Blue eyes of hard flint stood out in her face, forcing Xanaroth slowly back and into his suddenly righted seat as his blade vanished. Gradually he averted his gaze and tried to hide the fear that washed over him as she continued to stare, reminding him of the one thing so many at the table had tried to forget. The silence was suffocating. Her glowing presence overawed the other lesser gods as Alanormir sat regally in her seat, eyeing the far end of the table. She motioned for those who had come with her to sit also. Viranil, a plump but pleasant middle-aged woman with strawberry-red hair, smiled, if slightly forced, at her companion and calmly seated herself in a simple rocking chair next to Alanormir's position at the table's head. Viranil was the goddess of birth and fertility, and a loving, caring woman who enjoyed the simple things in life. Anything involving dying or the deceased appalled her, and thus she avoided looking down the other end of the table. Instead, she knitted away at a small wool shirt to distract herself. The second arrival still stood, however, his stance in open challenge to the opposing sitters, of whom only Balthazar returned his hard look. With a grimace unbecoming his fine facial features, Paladinus, the god of honor, gripped his sword hilt and looked poised to strike. His armor was brilliant burnished steel with intricate gold script in lavish design over it, almost outshining his golden cloak that flowed over his shoulders. Youthful in appearance, the well-groomed dark hair and carefully trimmed mustache belied his righteous fury. The god was often given to fighting before talking, but he was always well-intentioned in his actions. Paladinus, Alanormir gently placed her hand on her son's, causing his death grip on the sword to loosen. This is not the time to be rash. Please sit. Bowing with the utmost deference, Paladinus released the sword to end his aggression, causing hilt and belt to evaporate as he sat next to Viranil, with a respectful nod for all at his end of the table. He settled into his smoothly carved maple seat and calmly positioned his hands on the arms with such obvious effort it defeated his attempt to appear relaxed. Tyrannus caught his eye from the left and turned as the massive armor inclined his head, hand over heart. Paladinus smiled, for it is a salute one of his paladins might use before entering battle. It meant that Tyrannus would fight with him, if it came to that. The two had much in common, but often did not think alike. As soon as Paladinus had settled back again, another sitter arrived, bathed in a blood-red cloak that covered him to his ankles. Croarl was a terrifying sight, with shaven head, blood-flushed eyes, darkly tanned skin, and pointed ears to match his ever-visible pointed teeth. In all his existence, Croarl had never stopped smiling with that horrifying grin. His chair was an instrument of torture, with large spikes protruding from its seat and back, and yet he sat in it as though it were padded with the softest of feathers. Croarl did not speak, as he had no tongue, but he really did not need to. His appearance shook everyone, including those at his own side of the table. Croarl was the god of murder, and he was known for savagery beyond any bounds. It would be safe to say that his brethren tolerated rather than truly trusted him. Coming to the table at almost the same time was Galaron, the god of magic. A middle-aged man with an extremely calm exterior, he looked perplexed at the staring match going on between the opposing sides. He looked at Croarl almost as calmly as Alanormir did, but with a shake of his head as though seeing a misbehaving child. Nothing ever seemed to startle him, no matter how bizarre or twisted. Galaron was often mistaken for an emotionless god, but he was quite the opposite, as he merely hid his feelings better than his brethren. His chair was of plain wood with stars and moons on the leather cushions. He seated himself calmly, propping his staff against his shoulder as he sat across from Lorima. The two often had spats, as nature and magic tended to conflict with one another, but in the formation of Tethtanir they had discovered they were also very good at working together. Despite the deep connection between the two, Galaron did not even glance up at her, but leaned back in his chair. He stared at the tabletop and traced patterns across it with his finger, saying nothing and looking unusually pensive. Lorima, rather than being peeved at his dismissal of her, gently extended an arm to him. Resignedly, Galaron leaned in and the two exchanged an unusual, quiet conversation for their ears alone. Galaron looked at her with dark concern and whispered, "This is a mistake." "I know," Lorima said softly. "Nothing good can come of this, no matter what it is." Galaron sighed. "I wish I never gave it to them. It's too much of a burden for anyone to bear." Lorima cocked her head in obvious confusion, the faint sound of shaking leaves accompanying the motion. "Gave what, Galaron?" But the god of magic did not answer. Instead, he turned back to the table and began tracing again. As he did, the room noticeably darkened, and the next two sitters arrived. They moved slowly, with deliberate calm, from the black end of the table. The first, Lovart, god of change, was a kindly-looking man with long, thin hair streaked with gray, always seemingly lost in his own thoughts. Lovart was the most confusing of the gods, having given much of his power to the growth and flourishing of the mortal world, and, it seemed, having lost some of himself in the process. He came with his father, Neroth, god of death and shepherd of souls. Lovart had been the first of Alanormir and Neroth's children, born from their love of one another in the earliest days of the gods, a love that no longer persisted. Neroth and Lovart came forward. The god of change appeared, as always, to be adrift in his own mind and utterly unaware of tension in the room. He sat quite calmly in a chair that cannot be effectively described, its every facet shifting and twisting at a speed rending to the eye, occasionally displaying something so impossible that it drove a close watcher to head pains. No one looked directly at it, and Lovart appeared not to take notice. Narath had come behind him, and stood in his archway calm and reserved. His drawn face lent him the look of a corpse, but full of an intense and impassioned belief that gave him life. Seemingly larger than any figure of the room, save Alan Normir, he stood resolutely before the table. His pale skin was like that of new-fallen snow, standing out against the night black of his dark robes and dark hair that hung past his jaw, held down by a crown of shining metal with black thorns. Lined with the bleached bone-white cloth of the robes settled around a body that filled them despite the wanness of his face. Where Narath's visage was that of a dead man, and his body seemed that prime of youth. He walked softly on heavy black boots, his eyes as deep as an abyss. Without a word to anyone, he sat in his obsidian chair carved in a tapestry of death and depictions of somber funerals. Settling his elbows on the table with his hands in a steeple, he eyed the others calmly over his groomed fingers, preparing to speak. Only when he saw the table was still short one sitter did he do so, however, his voice carrying a soft, yet unquestionable tone of command. "Where is Curvin?" There was a pause as the sitters each looked at one another, then at the place where the god of time should have been. It was rare for anyone to arrive after Narath. The god of death used his late entrance to display his authority and intimidate the other first gods. Curvin was showing a rare bit of defiance by arriving later than usual. The table remained quiet, each god contemplating this new development. It seemed the most benign of their number had found his own passive way of resisting whatever was about to happen. Despite himself, Narath was impressed, though he was careful not to show it. A faint blue glow appeared in the last archway, and all the seated deities turned to watch the arrival of their final member. Curvin had no semblance of a corporeal body. He, if he could be considered a he, was a strange blue cloud that hovered just off the floor. Curvin's only humanoid characteristic was his bright glowing eyes, a sharper blue than the many hues that made up the shimmering mass of his form. Without a word of explanation, he moved to his place at the table and seemed to settle, not actually sitting on anything, but somehow appearing to have set himself down. Choosing to ignore the strange actions of his fellow, Narath attempted to assert his control over the meeting. Though he had not called it, he saw this gathering as an opportunity to take command of a rare moment among his kin. "Well, does anyone know why we have been called here?" Reyes spoke quietly from his seat. "To negotiate a peace, perhaps." Xanaroth rose, ready to renew his fight with the pacifist god, but a look from Narath seated him again. The towering god of death turned to Reyes with a mirthless smile. "I suspect, Reyes, that you may be a bit off the mark." Narath looked pointedly at Alan Normir, the first time he had acknowledged her presence thus far. "Would you like to explain why you had the mortal representative summon us?" Alan Normir spoke softly from her seat. "I thought it more likely you would all come if the invitation came from him, and not from myself. Though I was not deceptive, you did tell them you were summoning them on my behalf, Philandros?" The odd, wiry elder stirred slightly and muttered, Yes, of course." Halting briefly as he seated himself, Narath was stung, as always, by the words of his former wife. He took a moment to gather himself before pressing further. "Well then, we are all here. Now I wish to know to what end." "Yes," Galaron echoed, still tracing the table nervously. "What is the meaning of calling this meeting? We have not come together in a very long time, not since—" He trailed off, and a great silence descended like a dark cloud over the archway temple. Alan Normir cleared her throat as calmly as she could manage. "For some time, our ability to directly engage in the lives of mortals has been severely limited. This has given them time to make something of their own way in the world, but avenues for interference remain. I have long been opposed to our direct involvement in the world of these mortal creatures we help bring to life, and have watched over for eons, but that has not prevented it from occurring. I do not believe the current state of distance between we immortal gods and those mortal races on Tethtanir will last." Narath's eyes narrowed, and he watched his former love speak calmly and clearly to the assembled gods. Outwardly he was attentive and thoughtful, but inwardly he was full of fear. How much did she know? Narath and Alan Normir unintentionally exchanged a look that was quickly broken. The others did not observe the uncomfortable moment, lost in their own thoughts and shame. Narath spoke softly. "What was given to the mortals came from us. The world of Tethtanir is ours, and so are they. They must remember where they came from. They must remain loyal to their creators. Each day we allow them to go further astray from our guidance, the danger to both our realms grows." "As you say," Eleanor murmured, her eyes down, "the world was a gift. We have no right to dictate what is done with it, and its people. or to enlist them in our personal crusades. It was an ancient argument, and one that had remained for ages unresolved. The silence following that exchange was the most smothering, as it seemed every sitter waited for the eruption of the old feud that now had been brought forth once again. But it did not come. Eleanor waited for what seemed an eternity. Then she rose slowly and faced Narath, forcing herself to hold his gaze. With the severing of our bridge to the mortal world, we can only speak to those on Tethtanir who are of the strongest faith, or enter the temples built in our honor. Others we might find in dreams, should we stumble across them on those myriad half-conscious roads crisscrossing the borders of their world and our own. However, the fact remains that there is a barrier between us and Tethtanir we cannot cross. Still Narath said nothing, now intensely curious as to what Eleanorma was up to. He had truly no idea why she'd summoned the first gods to the Archway Temple when the call had reached him, but this meeting was even more unusual and its purpose more beyond his reckoning than he had expected. Unconsciously, he leaned forward, rising slightly from his chair, trying to pull some clue from Eleanorma's face as she continued. Briefly, the goddess of life looked up, but she swiftly broke eye contact with him as she said, "The rift between us and them is one we cannot repair, but we all know that grave dangers lurk beyond our world and theirs. Once, the power of a god was given to one mortal man so that he might face down a great threat and defeat it. Many of us disagreed with this, but it has been done. The precedent was set." Eleanor took a great breath as she finally came to the reason for calling the meeting. "I propose we permit such gifts of power be offered again to those mortals who would, in total faith and stringent belief, ask for them." Lorima was the first to react, and did so with relative calm, though the entire room simmered with grumblings of disbelief and confusion. "We already gave the priests, the faithful, powers to work feats beyond the constraints of any mortal. Why bring this additional boon forth as a possibility? To say nothing of the fact that you, Eleanormir, most ardently called for the condemning of that same aforementioned action when it happened," Reyes said with a tone more in line with the near total disbelief of the other mortals. "How can you, of all of us, suddenly have changed your opinion so drastically?" "I wonder the same," Narath said with a hard voice. "Are you beginning to soften your view on our duty to the mortals of Tethtanir?" "The duty you describe," Paladinus grated, "is more in line with their enslavement than our bestowing of blessings." Narath shot the lesser god a look that could have set him aflame had it been manifest as a torch. Paladinus did his best to remain stoic under the authority of Narath's stare, but his power was palpable even in that house of neutrality. Eleanor interrupted the seething tension. "I am not abandoning my position. The mortals should be allowed to make their own way in the world, with our aid coming only upon request. This is why the bridge was broken. All I am suggesting is that we agree to provide them with more power to defend themselves if they truly seek and deserve it." "It sounds to me," Balthazane said incredulously, "that you are retroactively admitting you were wrong when you condemned the tactics enacted to destroy the god sorcerer." An audible intake of breath came from the most of the sitters at the mentioning of the name. Even Lovart, who had appeared completely unaware of the proceedings before him, shot a look of disapproval at the god of betrayal. Eleanor shook her head defiantly. "No, I am not admitting that. Tristane Azurius was deceived. His request for the ability to save his homeland was not the same as a man or woman of true conviction asking their trusted deity to aid them in a time of greatest need." "And how are we to determine who is truly in need, truly faithful?" The irritation in his voice was clear as Narath at last moved to seat himself once again, believing the meeting was about to dissolve into a stalemate, as so many had before. "The determination is not ours to make." The voice, if it could be called that, echoed pleasantly in the minds of the gods about the table. They turned their eyes on Curvin, who remained settled in his place, projecting his thoughts out toward them all. "When the bridge between the godly realms and Tethtanir was destroyed, it eliminated our ability to reach out to the mortals. We can observe them, we can answer their prayers, but we cannot bestow power upon those who are not strong enough to request it. In the simplest of terms, the road between gods and mortals is now of a singular direction. Even if one of us wished to grant a part of ourselves to a mortal, they would need to be mighty enough to reach out to us, and durable enough to handle the merging of their life force with even the smallest fraction of our own." There was silence about the table as the first gods considered Curvin's words. Narath leaned back slowly in his chair, understanding beginning to dawn upon him. Eleanor had played this very well, he realized. Her proposal was reasonable and in line with his own very vocal belief that the gods had to take an active role in commanding and controlling the mortal races. It would be completely inexplicable for him to oppose this suggestion, and worse still, it would reveal the real work he had been doing behind the scenes. Narath realized what this meant. Eleanor had learned something of his plan and was taking steps to counter it. He was not sure how she believed this would prevent him achieving his goal, but he now knew he needed to find out. The proposal is on the table. I brought it here against the counsel of some because I still believe that even with all the violations of order and unspoken law we have seen in our existence, there must be some attempt at unity. Eleanor spread her hands beseechingly. What I ask is already possible. Many terrible things have been done in the name of conflicting ideology, including passing a piece of a god to a mortal. I simply wish us to once again deliberate our actions, instead of selfishly taking them in hand. There was a long silence of consideration, and it was surprisingly Virinil that finally broke it. The quiet motherly goddess set her sewing work down on the table and knit her fingers together, leaning forward. As you say, this giving of power is something we all know to be possible, regardless of our consent. Any one of us could do it. But not, Reyes added thoughtfully, unless requested by a mortal. And, Narath finished, one strong enough to accept a piece of a god. Then, Virinil said, I believe this proposal is acceptable. The constraints in place lead me to believe we will not see hundreds of god-blessed mortals running amok on Tethtanir, unless I am missing something, Curvin. The god of time responded impassively. Truthfully, there are likely less than a dozen mortals in all of history who could ever hope to accept this gift. Virinil nodded as though that settled the matter. Then I support the proposal. The goddess of birth placed her hand palm down on the table before her, signaling assent. A few of the other gods followed suit in short order, Palladinus, Reyes, and Delvidia. With some hesitation, Lorima glanced at Eleanormir. There is something more to this that we who have been called here cannot see. The bearer of the message, and one so seemingly simple, makes me distrust it. I will not support this. Lorima kept her hand clear of the table. To her shock, Galaron placed his forward, palm down. He did not meet the questioning glare of the goddess of nature, keeping his own eyes down. Taranis and Curvin remained opposed, but said nothing to explain their reasoning. Finally, Narath broke the stalemate, placing his hand palm down on the table and looking pointedly at Eleanormir. It would make little sense for me to oppose an action I have supported in the past, would it not? There was no response, but with Narath's vote came those of Balthazane, Xanaroth, and Croarl. The proposal passed with only Taranis, Lorima, Curvin, and Lovar in opposition, though perhaps the God of Change had simply not realized what was happening. As the voters pulled back hands from the table, the meeting began to dissolve. Eleanormir stood and drew up her chin with faltering regalness, whispering a nearly inaudible thank you to the attendees. Realizing that was all that would occur that day, most of the other gods left swiftly. Lorima tried to corner Galaron, but the god of magic swept from the table first and disappeared through his archway. Turning to stare at Eleanormir once more, still probing with her eyes to understand the hidden game the goddess of life was playing, Lorima finally left exasperated. In time, only Narath, Curvin, and Eleanormir remained, with the odd little man, Philandros, reclining on his rickety stool in seeming obliviousness to the tension about him. Narath opened his mouth several times, searching for the correct words, but finally closed it and shook his head. He turned from Eleanormir and nodded curtly at Curvin before striding proudly through his arch. Eleanormir, who had kept her back to him to ensure her face gave away nothing more of her thoughts, whispered, Is he gone, Curvin? Yes. The god of time turned his brilliant eyes on the goddess of life, his thoughts ringing clear and cool in her mind. I had truly considered avoiding this meeting altogether. I know. We spoke of this before, you and I. I still believe it was unnecessary to keep up the pretense of following some misplaced code of conduct among your kin. Eleanormir turned and eyed the god before her. Our kin, Curvin, or have you forgotten you are one of us? I apologize, Curvin shifted slightly. Sometimes it is difficult to feel the same connection to the others that you do. It was necessary, Eleanormir said, seeming to ignore or not have heard Curvin's response to her question. I needed to do it to remind myself there is still morality, right and wrong, among us. Curvin did not respond. Eleanormir continued. It means very little. You said yourself that there is a fleeting chance such mortals even exist, and who is to know the character of such men and women? They are as likely to be faithful adherents to Narath as to any god. Curvin considered not answering, but he felt compelled to do so, and when he did, the fluid thoughts through Eleanormir's mind carried hints of doubt and nervousness. There is one mortal who has already reached out. Eleanormir straightened sharply and, despite herself, moved towards Curvin in intense interest. Truly, who are they? From which of us do they seek the gift of our power? Curvin's silence accompanied the slow understanding of the goddess. It's you. The mortal is a follower of you. How else would you know one had been found already? Yes, Curvin replied, and Eleanormir could sense weariness in the words, and that is why I thought to avoid this meeting. Not because I believed you honestly foolish enough. Not because I believed your honesty foolish and unnecessary, though I still hold it shows your hand to Narath and gives him an advantage he does not need. No, I wanted to avoid this meeting because I have not decided whether I should grant this request, and I know what you would wish of me. You telling me this is evidence enough you've already decided. Eleanor's face became desperately earnest. You know this is one chance, and a slim one, to oppose Narath and give mortals a hand in deciding their own fate. Fate. Curvin rose from his settled position. A strange choice of words, especially for you. Eleanor did not answer, but her face could not restrain the tick of pain Curvin's insight had caused her. I have examined the threads of time and the outcomes before us. Even this may change nothing. The end of our world and theirs may be irreversible. But there's a chance, Eleanor insisted. Even the smallest chance would make it worth doing. Excuse me. The two gods turned to Philandros, who was risen from his seat and was once again attempting to smooth his irreversibly wrinkled clothing. I know it is not my place, but speaking as one of the mortals, a chance to avoid the destruction of our world would be, appreciated. Eleanor smiled slightly, despite herself, and Curvin seemed to have received the reasoning he had been trying to pry from his fellow god through the simple expression of the mortal. Very well, it will be done. Curvin made to leave when Eleanor spoke quietly. Curvin, who's the mortal? Curvin paused at his archway and remained still for a long time, long enough that Eleanor thought he'd forgotten the question. Then his voice flitted through her mind. An unborn child. Even though she possessed none of his gifts for communication, Curvin could feel the shock emanating off of Eleanor. How's that possible? How could they request? They did not. The mother did. She's not strong enough. A piece of my power would kill her outright, or worse. But within her I could sense it, a mortal of incredible depths of resolve and strength. She asked, but not for her. Before Eleanor could respond, Curvin was gone. Philandros remained, equally stunned, standing before the table. Without a word, Eleanor left swiftly, her hand on her chin as she pondered this new development. For his part, the Revenant remained in silent contemplation before tapping the brooch on his disheveled tunic and slowly fading from view, returning at last to his home on Teth Tanir. Another quick drink break. I'm at least going to go through the next section, and then we'll see how we're doing on time. But it should be okay. Xanaroth raged to no one in particular. How'd she know? This was our plan. We've crafted it, and yet somehow she calls all our kind together to reveal everything. The black-clad god smashed his fist upon the iron table by which he stood. They were in Narath's home, his realm within the greater plane of the gods, in the main chamber. It was bedecked with weapons from countless ages, and the walls lined with tomes of every tongue on Teth Tanir. A massive map, hovering freely above the cool black stone floor, was in the center. Xanaroth was to the left of the steel-spiked double doors of the entrance, a mere aesthetic formality, as in their own plane the gods could move freely without need for conventional portals. No one paid him any mind. Balthazar sat calmly in a fine wooden chair, stroking his perfectly oiled goatee, and drumming his free fingers on another iron table. Corral, grin still affixed to his face, stood arms folded off to one side, seemingly unconcerned with the current turn of events. Indifferent, or perhaps just beyond involvement, Lovart ran a finger over the backs of the many books, searching for something only he could want. Xanaroth snarled as he realized no one was paying any attention to him. He turned from the table and stomped across the hall to the map, still speaking if only to himself. And what should I care? My involvement in our little plot has been minimal. At least I cannot be blamed for its collapse. Balthazar did not even look at his brother. You were kept out because you have nothing to offer a situation that requires tact. Xanaroth spun on him and pointed sharply at Croarl. And yet that damned fiend does. Balthazar smiled disarmingly. Croarl excels at murder and mayhem, two of my favorite pastimes, and efficient ways to accomplish certain goals. If anything, his talents are all the more necessary now. I suspect soon we will have a mortal to track and dispose of. Xanaroth seemed ready to continue the argument, but the room darkened noticeably as Narath entered. The taut skin over his bloodless face was contorted in a look of puzzled rage. He gestured to Balthazar as he strode determinedly towards the map in the center. Get that damned fool here, now. Balthazar disappeared immediately, leaving an empty chair behind, and Narath motioned for Croarl to fetch him a glass from the table in the corner. Lovart pulled a book from the shelf with a sigh of contentment and began reading where he stood. As Croarl handed Narath the glass, he addressed his son Xanaroth. Fear not. You will have a chance to partake in the efforts I have begun. It seems our plan has been forcibly altered. Balthazar materialized by the doorway with a nervous-looking Galaron beside him. The god of magic adjusted his robes and avoided making eye contact with Narath. The embattled god of death drank his glass dry and passed it back to Kroarl before addressing the new arrival. How did you not know? Galaron managed to meet his glare. I'm only privy to some of the business of the neutrals. We each mind our own spheres of power. It seems your wife discovered some part of our bargain and moved to stay in front of it. She's no longer my wife, Narath whispered softly and dangerously. He then took a second glass of strangely red liquid from Kroarl and turned it slowly in his hand. It matters not if she knows of our agreement. No offense intended, brother, but it is secondary to the other efforts I've undertaken on Teth Tanir. What alarms me is that she seems to know of more than just our plan to find a loyal servant to imbue with godly power, and that someone in this room gave her that information. There was a dark quiet as Narath's last words hung in the air. Though he was openly calm, his anger was clearly just below the surface. Galaron shook his head in disbelief. You cannot be suggesting that this is my doing. What advantage is there to exposing our effort? We've labored on this together for so long. It undermines that work entirely if it's revealed before we are ready to act. Narath studied Galaron thoughtfully. You have been known to retreat from more drastic action in the past. I stood next to you against the Forgotten long ago, fought as fiercely as any of us. This is as much my plan as yours. Galaron straightened himself proudly and pointed an accusing finger at Narath. I silently accepted her proposal, keeping our pact a secret. Clearly she knew you were continuing to pursue dominion over the mortal world. If nothing else, I did all I could to keep your larger scheme hidden. Narath grimaced and took a sip from his glass before setting it down on one of the tables. He knew Galaron was correct, but it did not make the realization that Alanormir was onto him any easier to swallow. There's only one solution to this little problem that will give me what I asked for in the first place. We go ahead with our original plan, but now we must add a new wrinkle to it. Galaron shook his head. I cannot do anything until we have a mortal who seeks me out. You said you could find one, but Curvin made it clear. Narath dismissed his concerns with a wave of his hand. Curvin's explanation operated within the limitations of Alanormir's proposal. We are examining other ways for you to empower a mortal. Galaron glanced about the room, realizing all the other gods were now quietly watching him. What other ways would those be? Narath stepped forward and placed a hand on his fellow god's shoulder. Gifting power is possible to a willing and strong enough vessel. Curvin is correct that the collapse of our bridge to physical entry in the world of mortals greatly impairs both our ability to find those strong enough to accept such a gift, and to bring it to them without being called. I thought this was the difficulty you were working to resolve. Narath removed his hand from Galaron's shoulder and turned back to the map. It is, but I need our agreement to go into action before. To re-enter the world of mortals in my true and unrestrained form is essential to saving our world and theirs, but it will take time. If we were to give a mortal a piece of a god, particularly of one that was especially gifted in the arcane, it would both speed the process and strengthen our hold on the world before I can return to it. Yes, Galaron sighed, but that still does not solve the problem of finding a willing servant hardy enough to absorb such a gift. Not a gift. The others, excepting Narath, turned in surprise to Lovart, who was holding the book he had selected from the shelf open in one thin hand, gesturing expressively with the other as he spoke. I've discovered a way to extract a part of a fallen god and give it to a mortal, willing or not. This, of course, would require the god was already on Teth Tanir, since, as you correctly pointed out, there is no avenue for any of us to return there. Once the mortal is infused with this piece of weakened immortal, it would improve them in every way, including granting them the strength to absorb a true god's power. In essence, were we to find and extract a part of the lingering immortal essence from a god that had descended to mortality, we could give it to any mortal we chose, and then you could pass your own gift on to them, knowing it would be within their ability to command it. We also believe, Narath continued, his eyes meeting Galaron's with a great fervor, that this may remove the need for the mortal to seek out the blessing of the immortal. In short, we could choose who to give your might to, and mold them into the perfect servant of our cause. Galaron's eyes had grown progressively wider as they spoke. But you said you need a fallen god, a descended immortal, to extract their life force from. I'm sorry, brother, such an act would be an abomination. An abomination! Narath's voice rose in anger. You call that an abomination? The Immortellum was mere centuries ago, resulting in the demise of 2 of our own, and the departure of still more from the godly realms, and yet this is a bridge too far. I had no part in those deaths. No? Narath strode resolutely towards Galaron. Didn't we all play some part in them? We allowed them to happen. I am talking about taking a piece of a god who has given up their immortality, so that we can unite the world against the real dangers threatening it. You mean conquer the world. Narath scowled and swept his arm wide in frustration. What does the terminology matter? The mortals can help us, but we must command and direct them. Look at their history of wars, feuds, continual hatred. They must be brought under control and given purpose. Narath stepped still closer to Galaron, his tone imploring. Taking the lingering essence of immortality from one of our own, who chose to descend, will not kill them, Galaron. It will be painful, but it will not destroy who and what they are. And think of the greater good it serves. This must be done. Galaron did not answer, turning from the beseeching eyes of the god of death. He scanned the room, looking at the faces of those he had thrown his lot in with. A madman, a murderous beast, a traitor, and the embodiment of rage. What Narath said sounded like wisdom, but it was hiding a terrible process that Galaron could feel crawling beneath his skin. To grant a part of himself to a mortal so that they might speed Narath's return to Tethtanir and his conquest of the world was one thing, but to turn on his own kind to do so was beyond reason. No, I'm sorry, brother. I will not do this. Narath sighed audibly. Turning from the god of magic, he gestured to Kroral for another glass. I was afraid you might make this difficult. I do not mean to, Galaron said calmly. I simply cannot justify harming my own kind. Narath sipped his fresh drink and nodded. A noble ideal, Galaron, which I respect. Suddenly, Xanaroth and Kroral grabbed the god of magic's arms and held him fast. But I fear that I can justify it, and I already have. Galaron struggled but felt the hold of his captors impossibly strong. He reached out to his own realm within the godly planes to return there, and found nothing. In horror, he cried, What is this treachery? Narath placed his goblet on one of the heavy metal tables and crossed his arms within the folds of his robes. We have already found the former immortal and made ready to extract his godly essence. All our plans are in place. All we needed was your cooperation. I knew you trusted me, and I knew you would come here when called. Trust is dangerous, Galaron. Let me go, Narath. Galaron tried to sound fierce, but his tone was fearful. You cannot do this. You are no different than... Silence! Narath cut him off. You will leave when you do what I need of you. We had an agreement, and you will fulfill your part of the bargain. He motioned sharply with one hand, and Galaron was gone, whisked away to some far corner of Narath's home to await further debate. The god of death turned back to his goblet and stared down at the still liquid within, deep in thought. Finally, he snatched the glass from the table and swallowed it in one long pull, spattering red across his face and robes. Wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, he walked to the rear of the chamber. Leave me. Return once things are ready to begin on Tethtanir, and not before. Without discussion, the others departed as one. Narath was alone in his grand hall, the dark metal and somber trappings mirroring his mood. He clenched his fists as he wrestled internally with his decisions, assuring himself again and again that he was doing what must be done. He remained that way for a long time, and at no point did he ever feel he was truly able to convince himself of his own lies. So that's that section. I'm going to keep going. I saw, mildly, I saw your question, and I will answer it at the end when I get to the Q&A. White, nice to see you. And that's a good question, too, mildly, and I will be able to talk about that one. So there are 2 more sections to go, about 8 pages, and that'll be it for today. So, okay. Bit of a jump away from the gods for this part. Along the western coast of Lagotia, the Syrian Sea laps gently against the rocky beaches of her shores. The coast extends from the thick trees of silverleaf forest all the way to the most harsh and frozen lands of the great northern waste. Beyond the trees of silverleaf, several scores of miles north of the homeland of the silverleaf elves, commonly called the Foresters, sits the old and stubborn rock of Aves. The fortress is a pinnacle of human defiance against nature. The sturdy castle of stone is a simple structure with a massive curtain wall and domineering keep. It is home to the renowned Eagle Knights and defenders of the lands around it. The powerful fortress surveys and protects most of the southern lands of western Lagotia, the region known as Dragon's Watch. From here, the Order defends the bustling seaport of Halden Bay and the surrounding farmlands, historically fighting with the hated elven forces of Silverleaf for domination of the region. Within the keep, atop a titanic and sturdy throne of thick wood, sat the massive frame of Bullwife Margrave, more commonly known as Bull the Warrior. He was considered by some to be the most powerful commander of Aves in recorded history, a legend even to those from the fabled kingdom of Angladeus. Bull was the master of his people and a brilliant military strategist, and yet, at this moment, his huge muscled frame sunk into his cushioned throne as though the weight of his significant years had been tripled. Bull was faced with an invader from across the same sea which marked the western edge of his domain, an invader boasting an army 5 times his own in size and extremely well trained. Age had crept up on him not with dignity, but in sleepless nights in fear, as Bull watched the home he had built so carefully collapse before his eyes. About him, the high hall of his throne room was abuzz with conversation. His advisers, scores of them from many lands and walks of life, were in every corner of the hall arguing and frantically debating about how to save the great fortress of Aves. Now under siege for several months, Bull stayed clear of their disputes, watching the sun shine through. Oh, sorry, I thought there was a delay in the stream. Watching the sun shine through the stained glass windows that dominated the hall. These windows, crafted by the most ingenious dwarven designers around the time of the Arcane Wars, were his favorite feature of his home. They depicted the struggles and trials of the Eagle Knights from their formation under the wise guidance of the first commander, Richard Margrave I, to the noble sacrifice of Orson Jarn. Bull had spent many days in his youth staring at these images from his place below the throne, but he never imagined he would see the day when they offered him no inspiration. One of his advisers, a foreigner called Vaktan Elvak, strode determinedly through the crowd from the central doors and up the massive blue-carpeted stairs of the throne's dais. The other advisers gave him a wide berth. He was a justifiably feared soldier and cut an intimidating figure. Bull turned his gaze away from his musings to judge the man before him. The most noticeable of Vaktan's features, particularly in Aves, was that he was decidedly not human. His sharply pointed ears and entirely green eyes, with no visible pupils or whites, marked him as some strange being from a far-off land. Vaktan had come to Bull from Osmandius, the city of wizards and arcane magic to the northeast, but the commander of Aves knew his kind had originated from far more distant lands. Vaktan's elven features and strange eyes and hair were the hallmarks of Lost Elves, one of the oldest people on Tethtanir. Why he had come was never clear. Vaktan had claimed to have felt compelled to offer his counsel and services to a man he considered a great warrior. The Code of Aves declared that only males of pure human lineage could join the order, but Vaktan's ability as a tactician and leader had earned him the role of Bull's second-in-command. To avoid causing too much of an internal spat over appointing such an obvious outsider, Bull had never officially given Vaktan any sort of title. It mattered little. Between Bull's obvious high regard for the Lost Elf and Vaktan's skill as a fighter, none would openly question his authority. But even with his vast knowledge of combat and the silent endorsement of Bullwife Margrave, Vaktan was shunned by most of the men in Aves. Even the few outsiders of other nations gave him a wide berth. Vaktan did not help by making no effort to appease anyone around him, even the lord of the fortress himself. In better times, Bull would have likely had him dismissed outright for bordering on insolent behavior. Unfortunately for Bull, he was incredibly short on soldiers, and Vaktan was too useful to reprimand for most of his transgressions. Report. The king's deep booming voice caused a wave of silence to wash over the room. What do our scouts say? Vaktan Elvak reached the foot of the throne and offered his benefactor a barely noticeable bow. He was decked in silvery metal scale mail and matching gauntlets with a flowing black cloak and boots with armored black leather pants to match. His hair was the purest white, as common among his people, like new-fallen snow, and his eyes seemed to glow from within his head. He was a strong man, tall and muscular, with a flourish to his movements that demanded attention. Vaktan was known for his deadly swordsmanship and a tendency to seriously injure soldiers he deemed incompetent when training them. Many found his severity unnecessary, but Vaktan argued it was essential to weeding out the weaker men. The northern scouts report at least 10,000 men moving towards the eastern gate of the fortress, Vaktan said calmly. They burn and kill anything they come across. Most of the survivors are badly mutilated, and any of the women we found had been ravaged at least once by the soldiers. To the east? Vaktan shrugged, his oddly musical voice reverberating in the hall. Another 10,000 men, doing much the same thing. They appear to be in no hurry to meet us here, but it is clear that this fortress is their final destination. I have units stationed a mile from the fortress in a crescent shape to defend us from the east and the northeast. Bull ran a hand through his shoulder-length graying hair. How many? Approximately 400 knights and a few hundred archers. I will try to slow the enemy and then pull them back before we are flanked, but it will not be easy. Bull furrowed his brow in thought. The more you can pull into the fortress, the better, but do not give ground easily. Make them fight for every inch you can. Vaktan offered another slight bow. As you say, my liege. And the scouts to the south? Vaktan grimaced. I fear they were ambushed. We believe the entire regiment was killed. No. The two turned in shock to see a young figure, slight yet strong, appear in the entrance of the hall. He was clad in torn and tattered leather armor and wore a battered bow over his shoulder with an empty quiver at his side. His ears protruded back slightly from his head and came to points, showing a definitive presence of elven blood, and yet he was not a pure elf, for his body was too thick and muscular. His eyes were a sharp gray like stone, and his hair was a curling, cascading, dirty blonde that was matted to his face with sweat, mud, and blood. Over his shoulders, slouched by the weight, was the body of a man clad in the livery of an eagle knight. The wounded man's blue tunic was stained heavily with blood, and his face was pale, but he appeared alive. The youth carrying him, who had interrupted Vakhtyn, fell to one knee and set his burden gently on the ground. He opened his mouth to speak again, but a veteran knight guarding the hall's entrance rushed forward and backhanded him viciously across the face, sending him sprawling. "You have no right to talk to the commander, half-breed." Bull roared from his throne, rising in sudden wrath to his monstrous full height. "Leave him!" The knight stepped back with a low bow as Bull straightened his great frame and strode on his massive legs forward to meet the young man. Even as he was approaching old age, Bull cut an impressive and intimidating figure. He wore a huge breastplate with the image of an eagle, wings outstretched in flight, on its front. He was well over 6 feet in height and enormous without being cumbersomely so. He knelt by the injured knight, pushing his long, graying black hair away from his face as he gently lifted the man's head from the carpet. Vakhtyn stood beside him, placing a boot on the stunned half-elf's chest with a stern smile. "I would not move just yet if I were you, boy." The young soldier wiped blood from his mouth and met the lost elf's look with hard eyes, but he stayed where he was. Bull spoke quietly to the wounded man. "Tell me, knight, what happened to your regiment?" The veteran coughed and reached out to prop himself up with one hand. "My lord, we were attacked near the woodlands. A large group of soldiers had crossbows and caught us between them. We didn't stand a chance. My men... Most went down in the first volley. 20 knights dead. I was shot in the chest, but this scout, he carried me away from there." Bull glanced at the young half-elven form still leaning on his elbows on the stone floor, then looked back at the wounded knight. "You're the only ones left. How many were there?" "Not many, just enough to ambush us." Bull turned his head to catch Vakhtyn's eye. "Someone told them we were coming. I smell a rat in my fortress. Bring this man to the temple, have him healed, and get these damned advisors out of my hall. I want to talk to the scout alone." Vakhtyn motioned for the others to leave, and they did so quickly. A few knights came with a litter and removed the wounded man, who paused to thank the youth before being carried out. Bull bent down once they had departed and helped the young rescuer up. He eyed his battered figure up and down before demanding, "Name and rank, young man, and your town of origin." The youth tried to straighten his armor, but he gave up when he noticed how battered it was. "Trem Waterhound, scout, no home." Bull's eyebrows climbed slightly. "No home?" "No, my lord." The king digested this a moment. Vakhtyn, unseen by either Trem or Bull, shot the battered man a sharp look upon hearing his name. Bull glanced at Vakhtyn quizzically, as though sensing his reaction and concern despite not having seen it. Dismissing his suspicion swiftly, he returned his gaze to the scout. "Is what your commander says true? You rescued him from an enemy ambush?" "Yes, my lord. Well, partially. Partially." The young man averted his eyes and shifted nervously. "I did not take him away immediately. I fought the attackers for a time before I carried him out." "Did you now? And how many did you take down?" Trem shifted nervously once again. "Perhaps 20. I think that was how many arrows I used." Bull's eyebrows had now reached their peak, but Vakhtyn was less impressed. He snorted his skepticism and crossed his arms. "Arrows used is not the same thing as targets struck, boy. What is this, some attempt to inflate your own accomplishments in the hope of some reward?" "Vakhtyn," Bull glowered at the lost elf. "There's no need to be so accusatory. He saved a man's life." The strange eyes of Vakhtyn al-Vak met his master's, and he grimaced. "All I am suggesting is that you press for details rather than believe everything the half-elf has to say. I'm not questioning the heroic nature of his actions towards one of your knights." Bull cocked his head in confusion. "What reason do I have to distrust the boy? He's as battered as the man he dragged in here." Bull helped Trem to his feet and steadied him. "We are in desperate need of capable soldiers. The enemy is only a month or less from my front door. I will not allow foolish fears to prevent us from utilizing what fighters I have at my disposal." Vakhtyn shot Trem a look that unnerved him greatly, though he could not have said why. "Then give him over to my command and let me train him myself, if that's what you intend to do. After all, none of the other officers will treat him fairly, given his lineage." Bull paused in thought, eyeing both Vakhtyn and the half-elf. "As you say, it would be hard going for him with any of the others." Bull turned to the half-elf. "Trem Waterhound, for your valor I am having you promoted to the rank of sword. You are now a squire, and will begin your training on the path to becoming an Eagle Knight." Vakhtyn stepped forward, his mouth curled in anger. Trem thought the intimidating foreigner was upset at him, but it seemed Vakhtyn directed his frustration at Bull. "I did not say you should—" The lost elf cut himself off as though he knew he could not say what he wished to. "This is not right, Bullwife Margrave. You cannot set him on this path." Bull shot him a glare. "I am commander of the Eagle Knights. My word here is law." Bull turned back to Trem, sizing up the youth before him. "I think I will take a hand in the training myself, from time to time. After all, Vakhtyn, I need you to find out who's leaking information about our movements. I would say that is the greater of your concerns than who I do and do not choose to promote." Voktin scowled, still clearly unhappy, but gave no response. Instead, he launched a half-hearted salute and stormed out of the hall. Trem remained, still wiping blood from his mouth and looking confused as Bull put an arm around his shoulders. The commander patted his back gently and steered him towards the door. Do not let him upset you, Trem. I cannot account for his strange behavior. He is a capable leader, but a volatile one as well. Go now and find a healer in the temple to take care of you. Oh, and do not forget this. Bull strode purposely to the throne and reached behind it to pull free from a small pile of arms a worn-looking longsword. The hilt was battered and the steel notched in a few places, but Bull gave it a couple effortless swings and eyed the line of the blade. He grabbed a sheath, equally as beaten, and slid the sword into it. He marched back to Trem and handed him the weapon. We used to dole out traditional broad and short swords, but we have no smiths here to forge them, as they're making arrowheads daily now. This will have to suffice. It is a well-balanced weapon, and should serve you faithfully. Trem accepted the blade without comment and strapped it to his belt. Bull continued, delivering a speech that sounded to Trem to have been long practiced. Your rescue of your commander was the heroic act that earned you the privilege of becoming a sword. Should you perform another service that your peers commend you for, you will be raised to the rank of shield. A third act of selfless courage will gain you a mount and the title of steed. Should you live to see that point, Trem, you shall have obtained a sword, shield, and a horse to call your own. This is the progression of our order: 3 noble deeds of courage, 3 gifts from the commander of Aves, and then, if you are so worthy, you may be named an Eagle Knight. Trem nodded, examining the scabbard and hilt at his side. Bull smiled sadly as he watched him. Have you ever used a real weapon, lad? Trem shook his head. I was a hunter. I've never touched such a thing before. Bull seemed to understand. A sword is a wondrous weapon, Trem. A truly skilled swordsman can change the tide of a battle through his ability alone. The power and standing that comes with the sword makes you more than a common soldier. You'll be listened to and followed by those who do not have such fine weapons. But you must also beware. A sword does not the wielder make. You will learn many techniques from Voktin and I that will maim and kill your foes. A sword is not an axe, which could be used for chopping wood for your fire, nor is it a bow which you might hunt your food with to survive. A sword has but one purpose, and that is to kill. When you hold that blade in your hands, you possess power over life and death. With training, that influence only increases. But the blade is never the killer. You are, and you must be able to hold back that final blow when necessary. Bull patted him on the shoulder. Compassion is not a lesson I can teach you. You must find it for yourself. Then you will know what kind of man you are. Now, go. I have plans to examine in private. Trem bowed low and departed through the hall doors. He walked in a daze down the hallway past the personal bodyguards of Bull and through the open doors of the keep. He paused outside, contemplating this sudden turn of events. He'd come here to hide, and somehow he found himself in a place and a cause that seemed worth fighting for, led by a man he thought he could grow to admire. He took a deep breath and began to limp down the stairs of the keep. So, the bastard gave you a sword. Voktin was leaning against the wall of the keep by the doors Trem had passed through. He pushed himself off the stone and swept his black cloak behind his silver shining armor as he stepped in front of the half-elf. Even on the lower step he was eye-level with Trem, who now noticed his cloak clasps were in the unnerving shape of skeletal hands. Without asking, Voktin reached out and pulled Trem's new blade free, examining its make carefully. Well, at least he did not give you some flimsy weapon from a dead bandit. That's a true sword. Voktin handed the blade back to the half-elf who studied the imposing man before him. As Trem returned the sword to its sheath, Voktin continued in a tone that was not unfriendly. What did he promise you? Trem looked up and debated how much he could say. He said I was a sword, and in time I could continue to rise in rank. Voktin nodded, but simultaneously let out a quiet grunt of doubt. Of course he did. Beware of promises from men you do not know, Trem Waterhound. They are always easier to make than they are to keep. Voktin spun away and moved swiftly down the remaining steps of the keep. Trem followed him with his eyes as he disappeared in the direction of the barracks. He did not understand the exchange, could not pretend to know what Voktin was implying, and it unnerved him. Everywhere he had gone before Aves, trouble had followed him. Here he might be able to blend in as a common soldier and keep him to himself. The threat of death in battle oddly did not disturb him. When he was fighting for his life among the knights that day, he had felt strangely at peace, as though combat was something he was made for. All around and likely within Aves there was danger, but at least now he knew it was one he could stand and face. Touching the hilt of his new weapon, he slowly descended the steps and headed for the temple of Endoth to see if the priest would tend to his minor injuries. One last section to go through. And then I'll be doing Q&A. It should be fairly short. Above Trem, from a vantage point he could never have imagined, Eleanor watched him atop a magnificent mountain within her realm. She stood at the edge of the cliff and stared downward. A soft breeze in her golden hair brushed it clear from her ageless beauty. The wind was not cold, but she wrapped her shawl about her sparse shoulders anyway. A strange fear overtook her when she watched Trem meet Vakten, and the lost elf's warning to the young man had done nothing to ease her concern. The goddess turned her piercing eyes away from the scene below her and walked from the precipice. A short time, by Eleanor's eternal standards, had passed since that tense meeting of the first gods in the Archway Temple. In an effort to keep his creation hidden from the other immortals, or perhaps because some sense of doubt at his decision still gnawed at him, Curvin had withdrawn from his kin. Eleanor had attempted to reach out to him several times, hoping to learn more of his disciple, but she had failed. It had taken her many years to even locate Trem Waterhound among the millions of mortals on Teth Tanir. Her observations of the half-elf had left her concerned and afraid, both for him and the future of mortal and immortal alike. Trem could either stand in the way of Narath's scheme, or become a powerful ally to her former husband. As Curvin had said, all his gift had offered was the possibility of averting calamity. Shuddering again, despite the lack of cold, Eleanor returned from her post and began walking back towards her palatial home. As she did, a figure moved quietly from behind the rocks to her left and joined her, leaning on a walking stick with one hand and attempting to smooth his rumpled clothing with the other. They said nothing to one another as they began to descend the mountain, both lost in their own thoughts and more focused on the steps before them than the swirling clouds and mist about their bodies. The smaller figure rubbed his tousled white hair with a pale blue hand and sighed. Eleanor looked down at him finally and smiled slightly. "Is there something that troubles you, Philandros Calmarian?" The slight man did not take his eyes off the path before him, but shrugged his slim shoulders. Same thing that troubles you, I would think." The goddess nodded and patted the revenant's back comfortingly. "I fear I may have made a terrible mistake." Philandros offered no response. "Still, I could see no other solution, at least if there is to be hope for your kind, now." Indeed." Philandros' tone sounded unconvinced. Eleanor removed her hand and reached into her robes, pulling forth a small pendant. It was made of slim curves that wound thin streams of glass-like obsidian and shining silver mithril around the hilt and blade of a sword. On one side, the blade was mithril, and on the other, the obsidian. Philandros took it with widening eyes and looked at her quizzically. Eleanor sighed. "I believe he will come to you, and your people. Give him this, and take him to Silverwing. He will need his aid." "My lady," Philandros shook his head in doubt. "If he goes to him with this, it will not matter. Many mortals have tried to enlist his aid, and yet the pendant is not a gift from him, but from me." Philandros looked more confused. "An apology of some sort?" "An acknowledgement." Philandros said nothing at first, then chose to change the subject. "You assume he will come to me, but the half-elf needs to stay alive that long. He's in grave enough danger now, and if Narath finds him, it is an unstoppable eventuality that he will. I have thrown my lot in with Trem, and you, and all other mortals. I have long said you should be free to choose your own destiny. I must put my own axioms to the test." "You always did want to trust us with the fate of our world." "It seems that you will get your wish." Philandros brushed down his clothes again, futilely, and sighed. "I must be going home now." Eleanor nodded and watched as Philandros' form shimmered and disappeared. Eleanor understood that his doubt lay not in the idea of giving a mortal power, such power and responsibility, but in this particular mortal. Curvin had imbued Trem at his mother's faithful insistence, but Philandros seemed to question the wisdom of trusting a half-elf to show empathy for his fellows. Philandros' people had been the first mortals. The Revenants were ancient vestiges of the birth of Teth Tanir, and to Philandros it must have seemed that they should have been the ones to take up this task. In response, Eleanor would only have needed to point out no Revenant had sought the aid of any god. The Revenants had hidden themselves away from the world long ago, driven by the trauma of a terrible foe that had nearly consumed them and the immortal gods who came to their aid. Their self-imposed isolation was understandable, but it also meant they had removed themselves to the sidelines in the battle for the fate of Teth Tanir. Eleanor glanced back up the path to the scrying cliff. She was tempted to go and watch Trem again, to warn him of her trepidations surrounding Vakten, to do something. And yet she knew Philandros was right. Trem had stumbled into a terrible trap in the fortress of Aves, and it would be his greatest trial of character and conviction. She would remain true to her ideals. Eleanor would not interfere by contacting her one hope. Trem would have to make his own choices and suffer his own consequences. She turned away from the cliff once again and walked down the path, fading into the mist as she went and leaving the world of mortals in the hands of one of their own. So that is the prologue, 29 pages. think I mistakenly said that it was 25 before, but every week I'm going to try to do Q&A for anybody who has questions. Doesn't matter what they are. I might say that I can't answer some things, but I'm going to start because Mildly Adequate Peanut, which is a great name, by the way, did ask a great question. Are the gods in their story related like the gods from the Greek pantheon, and do they need the faith of mortals to survive? So that's a two-part question. First part, are they related? In the Greek pantheon and the Roman pantheon, as I understand it, the relationships that exist are basically the same as any relationship that exists between people, in like our actual human families, aka, gods either having sex with one another and producing offspring, or having sex with mortals if you're Zeus and like to turn into swans and that kind of thing, and then producing demigods. In the case of the gods in Tethnir, the idea that they consider themselves brothers, sisters, children is more a sign of connection and relationship, and not so much a procreation. The 14 gods you meet at the beginning are called the first gods because they were the first ones. There are lesser gods that exist in the story as well that periodically appear. The first gods, like Neroth and Alanormer, were once married or considered themselves married. They consider some of the other first gods to be their children. But in the sense that they produced them, that's not necessarily the case, if that answers that part of the question. Do they need the faith of mortals to survive? I don't want to give things away, but to survive, not necessarily. But to hold on to what powers they possess, definitely. So the way that magic works in the world is there are essentially three forms of magic. One of those is the arcane, the literal language of the gods. That's what wizards do. They study the language of the gods, they learn to say and correctly sketch the language of the gods, and that produces magical effects. So that's your wizards, your mages, that sort of thing. Then you have some legendary races that actually have like magic almost flowing in their veins, like they're essentially part of them is powered by magic. And then the third one is those who are the faithful. They choose to follow a particular god, usually only one, if they really want to obtain any kind of power. And in following that god, they are given gifts depending on the degree of their faithfulness. The best example of this is Paladinus is the god of honor, and his followers are paladins, which is obvious with the name. And like paladins you would see in other fantasy stories, they are extremely like faith-based warriors. In this particular case, it's their dedication to him and this code that they have created of how a soldier is supposed to act, how a paladin is supposed to behave, how they're supposed to act heroically. The more faithful you are, the stronger your gifts from the gods. On the other end of it, if the gods don't have enough mortal followers or faithful or people interested in them, they can start to lose their touch with their place and their own existence. The one other thing I'll add, hopefully that answers the question, and if it doesn't, mildly just put another one up. The other thing that I'll add is that, like the Greek gods, there is a degree of, like, we call the gods immortals, but there's a certain degree of mortality, as is hinted at in the prologue. A few gods have, at the very least, descended, meaning they have become mortals, and others may very well have simply died. So one of the things that I'm attempting to do a lot in the story is to make it clear that while the gods are unbelievably powerful and far more powerful than the mortals, they're not untouchable. That's no fun. Yeah, so hopefully that answers the question. I'm going to just hang for a couple minutes and see if any other questions come up. And if not, I'll shut the stream down. And on Wednesday, I'll start with chapter 1. The other thing is, like I said, I have better recording equipment. Hopefully the audio is okay for this. But I will do my best to get the nicer stuff for future recordings. I don't know if that will be by Wednesday. I think it's probably going to have to wait until Thursday just because of where things are at. You can kind of see behind me. I got the wall here, but actually this corner, which has some of the recording equipment I've managed to acquire. That's going to be a recording studio that my in-laws are actually helping me set up. So that'll be pretty cool once I get it going. Oh, good. I'm glad the audio seemed okay, White. Thanks. This is actually book 1 of, I think, 6 or 7. So the first 2 are out. So I've got, that's the first one. And this is the second one, The Shield. The third one I'm currently working on, that's going to be a big part of my summer. And I'm not entirely certain where this series ends. I just know that the third one's not the last one for sure. I think most people assume that trilogies are where a lot of fantasy and science fiction stories come from, which honestly, it makes a lot of sense and it works really well. It's just, this is a story I've been working on since I was about 14 years old, and there's a lot to it. So, yeah. And I'm glad the audio is okay, because that means I can do this. I can do it Wednesday, and if I can't make the trip to pick up the microphone that I acquired, it's not going to ruin everything. So. Oh, that's awesome, White. I didn't even know you had picked it up. I appreciate it. It's pretty weird. At some point I can kind of talk about like how I've gone about promoting it, because for those who don't know, this is a self-published book. So like I have spent a lot of time at comic conventions and going to local places to like meet people who might be interested in that kind of writing or something like that, or just talk to other authors. So, I mean, if it's of interest to people at some point, I can always do questions about like, okay, so if you self-publish, how do you get people to look at your stuff or whatever? I mean, it doesn't even matter to me. I know you've been playing video games, which is what you should be doing. But even the idea that you own one of them and have read even like to the first or second chapter, that's awesome. Because the reason I started writing it was because I felt like I had this one story I wanted to tell, and if people wanted to read it, that would be awesome. And maybe I would meet, 1 or 2 people that would want to talk to me about it, or care. And I gotta tell you honestly, like I've gone to a bunch of conventions now. I've gone to libraries. I've gotten to meet all kinds of usually younger people, which I teach high school, for those who don't know, is my primary job. So at Hebron Academy. And so having people come up to me and tell me that they love the book and it's so important to them is both, it's all the motivation I need to keep writing, which I think I would have done anyway, but it's also just like, that's, the goal here is not to become like wildly famous or successful at it. It's just to keep producing a story and hoping people find it and it is meaningful for them, because that was the important thing for me as a younger person. I read a lot of fantasy, and it probably is one of the things that helped me get through most of my life. Still does at this point. So, yeah, personal writing style, has it evolved since book 1? Yeah, I do think so. The book 1 is heavily sourced from a very early version that I changed, and I really tweaked a lot of it. And I think that, so it's tough to answer this question without, basically the style changes both because I do think I've improved as a writer, and therefore my style has gotten better. But there's also a very deliberate changing of style as the story goes on, which will hopefully be noticeable. And I'm actually curious reading it if that will come through. So yes, it's evolved for a couple of reasons. Mildly, thank you. I appreciate you saying it was a great start. That's awesome. Is it possible to have the map behind me? Yes. So one thing that I can say, if you go to Amazon, you download the free version. I believe it comes with the map on there, but it'll be this one right here, which I'm holding up, which is the map that's in the book, both the oh my god, Kindle. That's the word I'm looking for. The Kindle version and the paperback. So, if you go and get the free like preview version off of Amazon, the map is in there. But I have like full blown maps. I can put one over my shoulder. I'll do that when the studio gets going. And yeah, as always, shout out to Hebron's men's varsity B hockey team, which is the winter sport that I coach there. So, if there aren't other questions, I'm gonna call it a night. And thank you all for checking in. Please tell other people to check it out and to listen, and if they like it, to follow up with more questions, and I'll do Q&A every time. But that was actually very helpful for me and hopefully fun for everybody else. So yeah, I really appreciate it, and I hope this continues to be something everybody enjoys. So good night. Enjoy the rest of your day if you have it ahead of you. If you're going to bed or you're just starting, have a good time.